Welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoy. The Psychology Talk Podcast is a unique conversation with experts in the field of mental health from around the globe. Topics include hypnosis and mind-body treatments, ethics and cultural diversity, psychotherapy and psychiatry, emerging treatment modalities, and much, much more. While you're listening, please give us a like and subscribe to the show. It helps us to continue to provide excellent programming. And now, here is the episode. Hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Dr. Brent Willock. Dr. Willock is a clinical psychologist in Toronto, Canada. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan. He's held positions at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan Medical Center, and he was the chief psychologist at the university-affiliated C.M. Hinks Treatment Center in Toronto. He's held faculty positions at York University, School of the Graduate Studies, University of Toronto, and taught at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. He is also the author of Comparative Integrative Psychoanalysis. He's the first editor of Understanding and Coping with Failure, Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Identity and Difference, Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Passion, on Deaths and Endings, and Taboo or Not Taboo. Today, he discusses his new book, The Wrongful Conviction of Oscar Pistorius. Dr. Willock, welcome to the Psychology Talk Podcast.
Thank you very much, Scott. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, your book is a fascinating reconsideration of Oscar Pistorius's case, the trial that took place in the incident that took place, I should say, in 2013. Well, maybe we should just let you kind of like talk about it. Like I asked you earlier, why did you choose this subject? Why on earth did you want to kind of go back through and come up with a psychological and a psychoanalytic analysis of this case?
Oh, thank you for that question, Scott. Oddly enough, it was entirely by accident, if there are accidents, that I came into this topic. I was writing a book on another topic having to do with criminality, psychopathy, and I wanted to check out a certain detail from the Oscar Pistorius trial, something about his shooting the 4 bullets into the toilet chamber. So I went online and to see if I could find a little bit of information I wanted, and up popped the judgment of Oscar Pistorius's trial by Judge Masipa. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. Can't even say why I thought that would be interesting, because I wasn't looking for the judgment of the trial, but it grabbed my attention and I read it. And I was quite impressed by how meticulously the judge weighed all the information, the conflicting expert testimony. And then she was about to pronounce sentence after many, many pages of this judgment document. And she says, Mr. Pistorius, there's 4 things about your narrative that make absolutely no sense. And she listed them. And I'll get back to that. But she says the court must make sense of all the evidence before it. But clearly she could not make sense of these things. But she said, in any case, I must pronounce judgment. And she sentenced him to about 7 years in prison for manslaughter. But when I read those 4 things that made no sense to her, and again, I must say, I don't know why, but it popped out to me. Oh, I understand those things. And I can't remember exactly my thinking process, but I think it had to do with altered states of consciousness, dreaming, sleep-wake states, something like that. And so I wonder, maybe... Well, then I began researching it, going into it, reading all I could about the trial. My curiosity was very piqued, and I started to research it. And there was only one other thing that I could see in the trial that would puzzle me, like these 4 things puzzled the judge. Those things that also puzzled the bail magistrate before her And so after months and months of expert testimony, they were still a total puzzle to the court. The one thing that I came across in the literature was that listeners may not remember the details of the case, but Oscar, it was Valentine's Day, and Oscar was, they had a lovely, he and his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, had a lovely Valentine's dinner that she cooked in home, and she gave him a lovely present about how much she loved him. And he went to bed a bit before her because she's an athlete and has to get up early to train and all that. And she wanted to stay up and do a bit of yoga. Eventually, they're both in bed, and Oscar, I guess he wakes up and thinks, I've got to take in the tall fan from the balcony door that had bringing in some cool air into the apartment. And he gets up and he's doing that. And then he's closing the blinds and the drapes and the door. And he hears a sound in the bathroom. And instantly he thinks there's intruders in his apartment. He fears that. There's a sky-high crime rate in South Africa. And he grew up very much in that fearsome milieu. So he grabs his gun and he tells Riva to get down on the floor and call 911. And he's going with his gun to investigate in the bathroom. And now the judge rightly says, well, Oscar, surely any human being would turn to his bedmate and say, hey, hon, did you hear that sound in the bathroom? And in fact, Oscar's former girlfriend testified at trial that happened quite often. There'd be the slightest sound in the night. Oscar would wake up in a total startle and ask her if she had heard the sound. And she would always say, oh, it's just the floorboards or the wind, and they'd all go back to sleep. So the judge rightly said, surely, Oscar, you would have turned to your bedmate and asked if she heard the sound. And but Oscar evidently did not do that. Otherwise, he would have discovered Riva Steenkamp was not in the bed, and then he would have quickly concluded she was the one in the bathroom who made the sound. Then the judge next says, and then Oscar, when you told Riva to get down on the floor and call 911, when she didn't respond, surely you would have shooken her by the shoulders and, Riva, did you hear me? This is serious. You got to call the police, get down on the floor. There's intruders. And then you would have realized there's no Riva in the bed, and you would have known it was she who made the sound in the bathroom. And of course, all this is true if he had been wide awake. So I guess my hypothesis that came to me, I can't say I created it, it came to me, was that that Oscar was wide awake, hyper alert, and also parts of his brain were asleep. So he wasn't thinking like any ordinary person. And the judge next says, you went down the hall, you're screaming at the top of your lungs, you tell us, for the burglars to get out of your home. And the judge says, surely Riva would have said, hey, Oscar, it's just me in the toilet. Calm down. Don't shoot. Go back to bed. All this. And the judge is right. Any human being, that was what would have happened. Riva would have said that. Oscar would have heard it, and he would have gone back to bed. But in the states of parasomnia, which you can think of as simultaneously being awake and asleep, part of your brain being wide awake, part of your brain being wide asleep. So, and when you're in those states, you can sometimes not hear what other people are saying to you. And actually, you may be telling the burglars to get out of your home, but there may be nothing coming out of your mouth. You may be just going, right. And you think you're giving a very clear message, but you're not, because your brain is not all there. So then the fourth question that the judge raised was, and why did you fire 4 shots? Why not 1? Well, that's a really nice thought, but I don't know I can't say that if I had a gun in my hand and I was in a high crime place, I can't necessarily say I would think to fire a warning shot and all that. But in any case, in parasomnia, uh, uh, Oscar, he fires the 4 shots, then he goes back to see Riva in the bed. And, she's not there. He instantly says, oh, geez, she may have been the one I shot in the bathroom. He goes back and he finds that to be the case. He breaks down the door. There are cases of people shooting their partner or shooting themselves while they're in a parasomnia state. And they don't wake up. They can shoot themselves in the leg and not wake up till several hours later. They see the bloody case or the corpse beside them if they shot their partner. And they can just sleep through this. So my thinking was Oscar didn't wake up until after the 4th shot. It's a bit like if the alarm clock rings, you may not wake up on the 1st ring, but you will by the 5th or the 6th ring for sure wake up and head off to work. So I think he fired the shots and he didn't wake up fully. He was half awake. He didn't wake up 100% until after the 4th shot. And then his brain seems to be working 100%. He instantly thinks he probably shot Riva, and indeed he did. And everything there is what Freud would call secondary process or logical full cognition.
Yeah. The rest of his brain, his prefrontal cortex came online, or
exactly.
Frontal cortex,
yeah. So
you're reading this, and so it sounds like you're like, oh, this makes sense based on what I know about parasomnias and sleep disorders, and I can see why it doesn't make sense. And did you step into it a little bit further and ask yourself why the defense didn't come up with some sleep studies for Oscar or some other things?
Wow, that's a great question, Scott. Yes. Well, in the first instance, I wasn't so surprised because this isn't the territory where I spend much or hardly any of my waking time in parasomnias.
Okay.
A psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, psychologist. No, I'm not a sleep disorder specialist per se. I somewhat am now, but I was.
Well, after reading your book, I would say you are. Yeah.
Thank you. But so I thought, okay, they probably didn't think of it because it's not that much in common thinking that such strange things can happen. I was quite ignorant at the time of the Kenneth Parks trial.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book as kind of an example of how a defense team could actually bring in the evidence. Maybe you can go into that some.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, Kenneth Parks, back in the 1980s, up here in Canada, not far from where I live, he, a young man, married, one child, he went to the horse races for the first time in his life, and he did well. And that positive reinforcement was very dangerous. He thought he had a knack for the horses, and he thought, oh man, I can earn a lot of money, and then I'll be able to send my wife to visit her folks in Australia. And so he kept on going to the racetrack, kept on losing money. He began taking money out of their bank account. He began committing fraud at work to get money. And then he was fired from work for this criminal activity. He had to put up the house for second mortgage to pay back the employer to avoid jail time. And it got to the point where his wife said, look, Kenneth, you've got to tell my parents and your grandparents who are almost your parents. You've got to you got to come clean and tell them what trouble we're in, and financially and maritally and everything. And so he agreed he would do that on the weekend, on Saturday. And let's see, but he didn't. He went and played rugby instead. His wife was furious. He said, look, I'll tell them at the barbecue tomorrow. I'll begin confessing at the barbecue at their home. And he had been severely stressed out by the mess he had gotten himself into, hadn't slept really in 2 weeks. Now, insomnia is a great facilitator of parasomnia.
Mm-hmm.
So he's up watching television. He falls asleep in his chair, watching Saturday Night Live. And then the next thing he knows, he wakes up 14 miles from his home, having standing over his grandmother, her corpse, really. He says she's got a frightened, help me look on her face. And he runs upstairs to the adult children, to their bedroom, and says, kids, everything's okay. No one's going to hurt you. There's no problem. Don't worry. These adult kids later say they didn't hear any words. They heard rah, rah, like a person might make in their sleep, something I was talking about earlier. So Kenneth, he drives himself to the police station and he says, I think I've killed 2 people. And his hands are all bloody, all cut up. The police take him to a trauma center and they stitch him up as best they can. And then he's put in jail. He gets a lawyer. By coincidence, the lawyer was a Toronto lawyer across the street from me, and her husband was a forensic psychologist who worked down the hall from me. Mm-hmm. And so I think it must have been Graham Turrell, who, being a forensic psychologist, well, anyhow, somehow he and his wife, the lawyer, thought this might have been sleepwalking or sleep driving, sleep killing, all these parasomnia events. And Kenneth didn't believe it was. He thought, that's ridiculous. I can't drive a car in the middle of the night in my sleep 14 miles through traffic lights and all this, and remember to bring the key to my in-laws' home and take the tire iron out of my trunk to assault them with. He nearly killed his his father-in-law, and he did kill his mother-in-law. He says, that's ridiculous. And he came up with a story, quite a bizarre story, that he thought was probably what happened. A great instance of how we rationalize what we don't understand. He said he thought some guys put a sleeping potion in his Kool-Aid that he was drinking that evening. And then they dragged him into their car and drove him to the crime scene, and that he woke up in the middle of the crime and tried to take the knife away from them, therefore got his hands cut up. They fled, and then he, of course, that conflicts with his telling the police that he thinks he just killed 2 people. But so the brain
again, the inconsistencies between are similar to Pistorius' case. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So when I read that, I must say, Scott, maybe to my embarrassment, that I thought, oh, this doesn't make sense at all. I think Kenneth Parks, I think his father was a dodgy character. And I don't want to say that because I can't remember clearly after these decades, but I think he looked a bit dodgy in terms of his character. And I thought Kenneth probably was too, and that he was, I didn't know anything at that time back in the mid 1980s. So, but I have since read a lot about that case, and his lawyer consulted sleep experts, some of them from Chicago. Rosalind Cartwright has a sleep disorder clinic there, and they were all unanimous. Although actually they didn't believe this could happen at first, but when they studied it more carefully and studied Kenneth, they came to the unanimous decision that this was parasomnia, and the experts for the prosecution didn't challenge it. They were convinced too. The prosecution appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and he was exonerated at every level. So it was found very credible, the expert evidence. Now, how did we get off into Kenneth Parks?
The parallels, I think you use it a lot as a reference point for analyzing the Pistorius case.
Correct. Yes, yes. And the very strange things, the very anomalous, paradoxical things that can happen in these paradoxical states of simultaneous sleep, wakefulness. Yeah, yeah. And Kenneth is a horrific, glaring example of that. Oscar's is a little more subtle, and yet death ensued. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously, he didn't drive anywhere and accidentally kill people in his sleep. Yeah. 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 But similar kind of parasomnias. Well, maybe you can go into a brief description because we're using that word parasomnia. I'm sure most people in the audience are picking up on what you mean, but that can mean sleepwalking or somnambulism and night terrors and a whole host of things, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes, it can. There's a whole variety of parasomnias. Somnia meaning sleep, para meaning beyond sleep. So a condition that's beyond the normal bounds of sleep. And the violent parasomnias are a subset of that, and considerable variety even within that subcategory, such as the differences between Oscar and Kenneth. Let's see, sleep. Now, what did you ask me?
Just kind of go through some of the parasomnias or the description of what makes them tick. Why do they happen?
Yes, right. Now, some of them, like the Kenneth Parkes one, that occurs in deep sleep, and one is usually has amnesia for the events, as Kenneth had. He had no concept of what happened to him between falling asleep and waking up over his mother-in-law's body. Total amnesia. And that's not always the case, but great majority of cases that happens in the deep sleep parasomnias. And then there's the REM, rapid eye movement parasomnias, that occur during that dream phase, the phase when we're almost always dreaming. And I guess the most common one in that thing is called rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. That's quite fascinating. A person is having a dream and they're enacting it. So Freud wrote that we can dream anything, no matter how violent or dangerous, because during our dream state, the access to motility is shut off. We cannot enact, so it's safe to dream anything. In the parasomnias and in the REM sleep behavior disorder, which is called RBD for shorthand, RBD. In RBD, the access to motility is not shut off, and therefore odd and dangerous things can happen. One example is a man in England was camping. They had a camper, he and his wife, and they came into a camping site. And there were some guys doing wheelies and so forth on their bicycles and kind of rowdy. So he moved the camper to a quieter spot. They went to sleep. During his what turned out to be a dream, he thinks one of these guys has broken into his camper and is assaulting, raping his wife. So he grabs him by the neck and pulls him off and get the fuck out of my camper. He doesn't wake up. This man doesn't wake up for several hours. So you can go through all this. You'd think you would wake up with all this activity of pulling someone off your wife or thinking you're pulling him off your wife. He wakes up and he finds his wife is dead. He has strangled her, and he calls the police and he reports, I think I've murdered my wife. And in the British court system, the experts testified and he was exonerated because apparently the expert testimony was convincing and compelling. So that's rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. And he remembered what happened. He says, I remember precisely the dream. I thought I was pulling this ruffian off my wife. I thought he was raping her, or maybe killing her, strangling her. And he remembered. So he didn't have amnesia. He remembered the violent, vivid dream. But he thought it was a dream, and unfortunately, well, it was a dream, but it was a dream with access to motility enabled rather than shut off.
Right.
So
Yeah.
those are the two basic categories of the deep sleep and the REM sleep parasomnias. Those are the two main divisions, I think.
I seem to remember in some of my readings in grad school and prior to that, they've done examples with, I think it's the brainstem, right? That creates a particular neurochemical. I think it's acetylcholine that stops muscles. It's an inhibitory I think a neuropeptide, right? And I think that they've done. There's a French scientist who removed some of that material from the brainstem, which produces this. I think it might have been substantia nigra, I'm not sure. And then allowed the cats, they observed the cats afterwards, and they'd be basically waking up, chasing things that weren't there, like chasing mice, doing their micing job, or going after flies and bumping into walls and stuff. So I think it's a very physiological kind of thing that some people have more of or less of, right?
Yes, that's correct. I think in the deep sleep parasomnias, the mechanism, the physiological mechanism may be slightly different. I think, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think it's different chemical reactions. For example, in the Kenneth Parkes case, they found that while the brain waves were asleep, there were also waking brain waves at the same time, or interrupting in an oscillating pattern. So they could see on the brain waves this simultaneity or rapid oscillation between sleeping and waking brain waves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So and a lot of that awake yet having deep sleep. Yeah.
That's what they found with Kenneth Parkes. And it doesn't mean that you'll always find that, but you often will, I think. And I think some of that research that might have begun in France was also followed up a lot in your town at the University of Chicago by a couple of physiologists actually doing research in that area. Important research,
yeah. Kleitman, I think, right?
Kleitman is the one I remember. Nathan Kleitman and someone else whose name escapes me. It is in the book, but
I mean, obviously there's a physiological mechanism in it, and even though the more fantastical ones are the violent ones, I think that everybody probably knows someone who sleepwalks, and they do. I think you mentioned it. It's a normal sleepwalking behavior, although very embarrassing and odd, certainly, is for someone who's sleepwalking to wake up and want to use the bathroom and use a closet rather than a bathroom. Yeah.
Yes. I think Kenneth Parkes' grandfather might have done that frequently. Yeah.
So there's a kind of a genetic component to this as well.
That's what's assumed, but it's not always there. But it does seem that if a sleep expert finds a family history of parasomnia and an individual history of parasomnia, that increases there is some research that both of those factors increase the likelihood of it happening. Yeah.
Right. And you do mention, Parks's issue with getting himself into hot water with a gambling addiction that shows up, and the next one I'll come in big and 5-1 odds, and I'll be able to take care of everybody and live the good life. But I don't remember anything. I don't recall anything in the book about his developmental history. But you do go into great length of Pistorius's developmental history. Not to say that's a cause for the terrible event that happened with his girlfriend Riva, but there is some evidence of maybe some attachment disturbance that made part of his makeup, which, people can have those disturbances or have attachment separation anxiety, obsessiveness with a spouse or a loved one. But that's not necessarily the motivation as to why the event happened, or that doesn't make someone a killer. But maybe you can go into a little bit of that.
Right. Where I think that might, I do go into quite a bit of that because I am a psychoanalyst, and I think I anticipated that a lot of my readers might be that way inclined. But I think how it might affect Oscar is his parents divorced when he was 6. There was probably a lot of marital unhappiness prior to the actual divorce date. At that point, his mother takes the children. His father moves far away, and mother takes the children to a less affluent part of town where even more break-ins happen. And his mother would sleep with a gun under her pillow or beside the bed. And if she ever heard a sound, she would wake up in a startle, call 911, grab her children, 3 children, bring them into her bedroom with the gun in the air, and wait for the police to arrive. Almost always the police would come and check the scene out and say there's no evidence of any burglars. But Oscar grew up in that high stress milieu with, I guess, in terms of those adverse childhood events, ACEs, ACE, that can predict a lot of adult physical and mental pathology in later life. He had a lot of them. And when he was 15, there were some actual break-ins in his home, but more often it was his mother just having her startled response. And when he was 15, his mother died, so he had that trauma as well. And she seemed to have some drinking problems that would lead the kids to trying to wake her up, and they couldn't arouse her, kind of like that still face research that Ed Tronick and others have conducted of how disturbing that is to infants when that was their attempt to make an experimental analogy to what it is like to live with a depressed, preoccupied mother, that you can't get her attention. They would ask the mother to not move her face when the kids are trying to engage her, and it makes kids extremely upset, kind of. And well, Oscar's mother apparently was sometimes like that due to her alcoholism, maybe depression, I don't know, but they could not arouse her. And so a lot of stress. In his romantic life, he became very jealous. He was with Riva Steenkamp. If she would, or if any woman he was dating would talk to another man at a party, he would get very jealous. Come on, we're leaving this party. Jealous, controlling. But that's the surface, jealous, controlling. Underneath, I would say, highly insecure and in terms of attachment. And so he has this chronic stress going on, not to mention the fact that he has his legs amputated when he was 11 months of age, before his first birthday. Both his legs are amputated because he was born with horrendous deformities. And then he's fitted with prostheses. He becomes good in Paralympic events, and then he dares to go into the Olympics. And he was a real fighter, determined, and he went into the 2012 London Olympics. It was 6 months after that he kills Riva. So he a highly ambitious, determined, competent young man, but highly stressed. And Oscar himself told me that I've had limited communication with him, but he told me that he only sleeps, he said 28 to 29 hours a week. So I think that was the figure. So just 3 or 4 hours a night, kind of sleep. And and yet he's apparently able to function on that. But that would seem to facilitate parasomnia, to have a kind of I think that would be classified as a sleep disorder. The coach.
I mean, technically, most people would probably need 6 to 8. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And the coach of the, I think it was the Paralympic team, would give him sleep medications to help him to sleep. So it was considered to be a problem. I suppose on a bad night, he would get less than those 3 or 4 hours. The average was 3 or 4 hours a night, but on a bad night. And so he would take sleeping pills. some of which can facilitate parasomnia in their own right. Um, so he has a history of attachment distress, and it manifests in his adult life, and probably contributes to his stress level that interferes with good night's sleep. And so I would see that a way that attachment, insecure attachment, I guess would be the technical classification, how that would create a chronic state of stress that would interfere with sleep, that would interfere with brain waves, so kind of a bit of a vicious cycle, beginning with attachment distress or adverse childhood events, ACE. Yeah.
Well, you had, a lot actually. And I was thinking about the attachment forms usually in the first 24 months. So having such an adverse childhood experience of having the amputation and the deformities, and probably a lot of concern on the part of the mother, a lot of anxiety there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And nonverbal stage of life.
Absolutely. Yes, the parents had consulted with nearly a dozen experts. What should we do? And some said amputation. Others said, well, we can do a series of operations over many years and try that out. They chose what they thought was the best of the two evils, namely cut his legs off below the knees, kind of.
Yeah.
Yes, and what that must do to parents, and as they try to help him to adapt and cope and get on with life while he's getting constant infections in his leg.
Difficulties there. Well,
yeah.
You said you had some contact with Oscar. Have you had any since the publication of the book, or has he had any thoughts about what you were trying to do?
Yes, only since the publication of the book. He wrote me a lengthy letter, and in it he said, I thank you for this book. It provides an explanation of what happened that night, not an excuse. So I don't want an excuse. I did it, but it does provide an explanation. And he, just before his sentencing, he'd been interviewed by British television, and he said there very tearfully, he said, how could this possibly have happened? Well, and I thought that was an interesting question, because he had a coherent story of how an almost coherent story of how it happened. He thought there were burglars. They didn't respond to his shouting. He shot. But in some other part of his brain, in terms of this dissociated states, in this other part of the brain, he was still, to the night before of his sentencing, saying, how could this possibly have happened? Even though he thought he knew exactly how it happened. So these paradoxical states of cognitive dissonance, kind of. And so I guess he thought the book did provide an explanation, a credible explanation of how and why this might have happened. I don't know if he was convinced that must be the case. Although I think he sort of thought that was the case. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, that makes sense. Has there been any effort to reassess the case in South African courts?
Oh, yeah. No. His lawyers have been preoccupied with trying to get him out on, not bail, but
parole, right?
Parole, that's the word, yeah. Out on parole. And he's been a model prisoner, as far as I can tell. He's had a very calming influence in the prisoner. He's very Christian and religious. He holds prayer meetings and Bible study classes in the prison, and a lot of tough characters are attending these groups. And he's bringing the temperature in the prison way down. So He's loved by the warden and the prison authorities. So he grows. Was
he as religious before he went to prison?
I think so. He was also, you could say, maybe a hot-headed young man with a passion for fast cars and guns and all this kind of stuff. But yes, he and his family, I think, were very religious. And I think maybe his group, Afrikaner group in South Africa, is that way, religious, but certainly he and his family seem to be. Yeah. And so I think he was before, maybe more so after, I don't know, maybe after an event like that, maybe you become even more religious.
Yeah. Well, and how long was his prison sentence determined to be?
So the prosecution kept appealing it, thinking it should be a longer sentence. And the Supreme Court of Appeal agreed, and they said, yes, it should be murder, not manslaughter, and it should be 15 years, not the 7 he was given. So he had already served 1.5 years, so he had 13 and a half left to go. And when you serve half your sentence in South Africa, you're eligible for parole. He applied for it, and they told him, oh, no, we made a miscalculation. You have to wait until the spring of 2023 to apply for parole. So he did that, and he applied for parole just a couple months ago. And they told him again, oh, no, it's too soon to apply. The appropriate date is August 2024. This seemed really weird that they would get the date wrong twice.
Yeah.
I can see one mistake, but I cannot see two mistakes. But so that's what his legal team have been dealing with, trying to get him out of prison. And I've had a little bit of contact with them, and I hope that one person connected with the case, a mental health professional, told me, he said he didn't think Oscar should appeal. He thought the parasomnia hypothesis was very compelling, but he thought Oscar should not appeal until he served his sentence. And I thought that was odd. He says, well, the reason is because half of the public is totally against him. The women's section of the African National Congress, the ruling party, was picketing outside the courtroom every day against what they call intimate femicide, which is very high, men killing their partners in South Africa. Yeah. So understandably, they were picketing against that. And so this mental health professional told me half the public is totally against them, over the top against them. At least half of the press is over the top against them, and half the courts are over the top against them. So no one would give him a fair hearing. They would just think it's a rich, privileged, white South African trying to weasel out of just punishment with a team of experts that no ordinary citizen could afford. Yeah. So that he should wait until he served his sentence, whatever that turns out to be, until he gets parole, and then he should appeal in order to remove his criminal record and stop being referred to in the press. Whenever he's referred to in the press, they say convicted murderer Oscar Pistorius or disgraced Olympic athlete.
I think you said one of the appeals was to give him murder rather than manslaughter, which, that's a heyday for the press to use murderer, right? I mean, and this is an unintentional homicide, I think, from your perspective, and it's a pretty convincing argument. I guess part of the appeal, like with the Kenneth Parks case, you mentioned that, I mean, it was a well laid out defense, and even the prosecutors in the case, they agreed with it. So they accepted the overturn, like his not being convicted. And it was believed that he probably wouldn't be a repeat offender because it's not a characterological issue. It's a physiological issue. It's a neurological issue. And I believe parasomnias are pretty easily treatable, or fairly easily treatable. Obviously, in the case of Oscar Pistorius, they would need to bring in experts. He'd have to have a PET scan or an fMRI or something like that while he was sleeping, or sleep studies. None of those were brought in as evidence to the court, right? It was basically, he was, excuse me, he was a huge public figure. Everybody jumped on it because it looked like a femicide, right? It looked like he was killing his spouse or his girlfriend intentionally. And there was a lot of evidence, even that was brought into the courts, that ruled against that at the time. But it was just not, the jury hung him, basically. Or it wasn't a hung jury, it was the jury convicted him.
No jury. They don't use the jury.
There was no jury. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Judge.
Yeah, the judge basically said, and the judge was even contradictory in their estimates of the data, right? Like saying, this doesn't make any sense. Well, okay, why didn't you look into why it doesn't make any sense? It wasn't, the assumption was that he was just making it up to get off. I assume. Yeah.
I don't know what the assumption was. She said, I won't speculate. It's true. It would be speculation, maybe evidence-based speculation, but it would be speculation. Whereas I think we as psychologists we want to know why. We want to connect the dots. The courts, not so much. They just want to find who did the shooting, and they don't.
Also, if you don't have a jury of your peers, if the system's different,
yes,
it's a magistrate that makes the decision.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Scott, there were some experts in Minnesota who I spoke with, sleep experts, and at the university there, and they told me, they said, "Oh yeah, as soon as we heard of the Pistorius case, we immediately thought it was parasomnia." And they said, we testify all over the world. They're known experts, and we're quite surprised that his team didn't contact us. So, but I think in South Africa, maybe they don't think of that. In USA, they do. Maybe in Canada or in a big metropolis in Canada, but other places are maybe even less aware than we are of the possibility of parasomnia.
Well, we were speaking earlier, and as I was reading through the book again, I kind of came up with this thought came to mind that, we live in a world that has a hegemony of waking life and the assumption that all individuals are a singularity and in control of their fullness of selves. And I think the parasomnias and other things that are more anomalous to our daily waking selves are an example of that. We're more of a symphony of selves, as someone once said, and part of that could be your lizard brain or your hippocampus, your limbic system, and then your prefrontal cortex, or who knows what, for goodness sakes. And I think that it is that idea that there's one person acting, doing a thing, which is not always the case.
No, it's not. I agree with you 100%, Scott. You sum it up very well. Absolutely. And I hope my book, if enough people read it, I hope it might be one of the writings that are out there in literature that might help not just psychologists, but lawyers and judges to be a little more open to this.
Yes, one would hope. There's a lot of things that go on in contextually within court systems and in any big system, governmental system or otherwise. Yeah. So, well, the book is fascinating. I hope that everybody out there gets a chance to read it. It's The Wrongful Conviction of Oscar Pistorius by Dr. Brent Willock. And who's the publisher again?
It's Torchflame Books in Durham, North Carolina. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Psychology Talk podcast.
Oh, it's me who thanks you very much, Scott. I totally enjoyed this interview. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. Did you know the Psychology Talk podcast is all over the World Wide Web? Well, not entirely all over, but we are on social media and we do have a website. Pop over to www.psych-talk.com to find out more about the show. All material is copyright the Psychology Talk podcast. Opinions of our guests are not necessarily those of the host or the show. Material is provided for entertainment and informative purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.